Obviously, this is a very dramatic moment in world history. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I want to start by trying to give us some framework within which to understand events. And I guess the simplest way of doing that is to try and distinguish what the current crisis has that previous experiences of war in the last 20 odd years haven't had. And I think the first thing to say is that this is an unusual moment, I think, for most people on the left, indeed for probably anybody that's been involved in the anti-war movement, because it's one of the very few times when our country and the Western alliance of which it's a part hasn't been the immediate aggressor. Russia is the immediate aggressor in this case. Secondly, and this is, I think, very important, the wars of the modern era, the wars of the, shall we say, post-Cold War era, have mainly been wars between major industrialized states or alliances of those, as I say, predominantly, but not always, the United States and the UK and other NATO countries, and much smaller, much weaker states, often former colonies. If we think about all the struggles in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Libya, with Iran, and so forth and so on, they have that characteristic. Russia isn't a colony. It's by no means the most powerful industrialized country, but it is an industrialized country. It has a kind of a middle European state GDP. It has a significant raw material and agricultural base, and of course, critically, both in its previous Tsarist form and in the form of the Stalinist states, it has a considerable history as a colonial power in its own right. So we're looking at a situation which is potentially much more dangerous than the war with Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. We also, of course, have another immediate difference because Russia is the immediate aggressor in this fight and not Britain or the United States and its allies. At the moment, there's no talk of British troops being deployed. So in a way, for our political establishment, this is a kind of cost-free military adventure. They won't have to kill anybody themselves, or British troops won't have to kill anybody, and British troops won't be killed. So it's a kind of, I suppose it's a kind of typically Johnsonian war. It's all about posturing, propaganda, bluster, without having to actually pay the immediate costs of war. So it's a kind of plastic Churchillian war. Boris can bluster away in the media and at the dispatch box in the Commons, but the immediate costs of war won't be borne by his or any other constituents in the UK. And perhaps some of the hyperbole that we have in the media at the moment is produced exactly by that circumstance. So I just wanted to make those preliminary remarks so that we understand that we're dealing with a kind of different political geography, if you like, than we were with the war in Iraq or the attack on Libya. So let's just move on concretely to what we, I think, should be saying and what some of us have been saying in recent days, weeks, and indeed months. I mean, the first thing to say, obviously, is we want an end to the war. We think that Russia should get out of the Ukraine, and we stand in solidarity with what has been a terrific rebirth of the anti-war movement in Russia itself. Now, I think those are absolutely elementary and obvious points to make. Um, but if we stop there, we would be doing exactly what the Tory government and the British establishment and the press want us to do. That's where they stop. They say, okay, we want Russia out. We There's the bizarre sight of them now solidarizing with the Russian anti-war movement all across the British press, when they've never ever had a single good thing to say about the anti-war movement uh, in this country. And that is just the beginning of the hypocrisy, because it's always true that the imperialists of one country um, want to see bad things happen to the imperialism of other countries. They're always against imperialism somewhere else. It reminds me of Karl Marx's comment that capitalists are always in favor of wage rises. They're always in favor of wage rises in another capitalist factory, increases the market for their goods, and puts up the costs of their competitors. What they don't like is wage rises in their own factories. And imperialism is just the same. The British are very, very keen on anti-Russian imperialism. They're very keen on anti-Chinese imperialism. They just can't stand anti-British imperialism. And that's the beginning of the hypocrisy here. And I like to think of it like this. I like to think, who has the consistency of argument and therefore the moral standing to condemn aggression in Russia, the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia? And in my view, nobody who supported the invasion of Iraq, nobody who supported the invasion of Afghanistan, nobody who supported the bombing of Libya or the supplying of arms to the war in Syria has any moral standing in this debate. Nobody who relentlessly supports the grabbing of Palestinian land by the Israeli state has any moral standing in this argument. The only people who have moral standing in this argument are the people who have defended the rights of small nations to independence, who have consistently said that major powers, simply because they are rich and well armed, do not have the right to interfere in the politics of other countries or to determine who or who will not be the government in another country. Only those people who've been consistently against imperial intervention, no matter where it comes from, should be heard with any seriousness in this debate. Because what the establishment want to do is to strip this discussion of context, to strip it of any history, to say that there should be no comparisons made with previous military conflicts, and that all history, particularly the history of their own actions, should be swept away. And we have to refuse to do that. There can be no serious historical discussion, no serious political discussion, and certainly no recommendations for action without context, without history, and without comparison. You know, you see these people on Twitter saying, "Oh, well, if you raise Iraq or you raise Afghanistan, that's just whataboutery. You know, you aren't dealing with the issue." Well, I'm perfectly willing to deal with the issue, but whataboutery is a perfectly acceptable, indeed necessary argument, because it says, what about similar circumstances? What about other invasions? What about your behavior? And those are absolutely critical questions to ask. So we won't be intimidated and we won't be stampeded into forgetting what happened in the recent past or the record of our own political establishment. Because we know that the people that are urging us to war now, that are urging the Russians to be defeated for an end to a war in the Ukraine, those people are up to their necks in the blood of Afghans and Iraqis, Libyans and Syrians. Syrians. These are people who have bombed and invaded their way across the Middle East and do not have the right to lecture the rest of us about what conditions should be applied in this particular conflict. Now, I want to look a little bit as well now about what some of the likely consequences of this struggle might be, because I think although we aren't yet, and I hope won't be, despite Liz Truss today urging young Britons to go and fight in the Ukraine, I suggest that any young person in this country who's thinking of heeding that advice should wait until Liz Truss or some member of her family is parachuted into Kiev to start fighting before they go themselves. Or anybody who is concerned, as I think we all should be, that the conflict has now reached the point where Vladimir Putin has put his nuclear forces on alert today. Anybody listening to this or watching this must know that this is a conflict with very, very serious, very serious consequences indeed. If the outcome of this were to be that Russia conquered the Ukraine, there would be thousands of miles of European border with a new Iron Curtain, with a direct military standoff between NATO and Russia. There would be incursions, there will be flashpoints, there will be a permanent threat of European war. I mean, thank God in many ways that the Ukraine hadn't already been admitted to NATO, because if it had already been in NATO, then NATO would have been committed by its charter to defend and attack on any of its members. And we would already be seeing, as we were at the beginning of the First World War, a treaty which obliged a conflict starting in a small country to become a European-wide conflagration. So I think we must hope that simultaneously the peace negotiations, which are underway or about to be underway between Russia and the Ukraine, do end in a peace settlement which guarantees Ukrainian neutrality and guarantees its neutrality by it not being a member of NATO. And there are, of course, there is a precedent for this. Both Finland and Sweden are obviously very definitely part of Europe, but they are not members of NATO. And they've never become members of NATO because it would destabilize the balance of power in Europe. And perhaps rather than trying to now involve them in NATO, which might be one more serious consequence of this conflict, there is now going to be a NATO meeting in which Sweden and Finland attend as guests. That's obviously a step towards perhaps including them in NATO. We would have a much more serious, much more dangerous situation if at the end of this Ukraine were in NATO, or if as a consequence of this, Finland and Sweden became part of NATO. That would obviously be destabilizing, obviously be a casus belli for future conflicts going forward. And of course, what we're watching here is the end of a long arc. Ever since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the East European states, NATO has moved relentlessly eastward. Now, the fact that Vladimir Putin says this as well doesn't make it untrue. It is simply a historical fact that that has been the case. It is simply an historical fact that NATO bases, and not just NATO countries that have joined NATO, but countries that have joined NATO and then had British and American forces deployed into them. That could have been different. They could have been in NATO, but not had the most advanced weaponry and the forces of the United States and the United Kingdom and others deployed into them, but they have. That process was always going to be destabilizing. It was going to be destabilizing because Gorbachev was promised by the American administration when the Berlin Wall came down that NATO would not advance an inch eastward. But that promise was broken. It was understood to be destabilizing. If you have a look at the Cablegate material released by WikiLeaks back in 2009, William Burns, who is now currently head of the Central Intelligence Agency, came back from a meeting with the Russians and said, "Niet means niet," that we've reached a red line here, that Ukrainian membership of NATO will be a red line for the Russians. This was understood by the Western powers, and they still went ahead with de facto membership of NATO, not membership in name, but membership in the sense that NATO troops were deployed there, thousands of them, that NATO arms were pumped into the country, that the prospect of them becoming full members was kept deliberately politically alive. These are simply the historical facts of the situation. It doesn't excuse Putin, doesn't mean that the Putin regime is an admirable regime. It's not, it's a dictatorial, an autocratic regime. But if you want to understand how global politics has unfolded, you need to understand what the effects of one group of people, which we don't agree with, the Western establishment, has on another group of people who we don't agree with, the Russian state under Putin. This is explanation, it's not justification, as I tried to explain to a correspondent from the Daily Telegraph only a few days ago, but she didn't seem to be able to grasp that quite simple distinction in English. Bit of a wonder that she's managed to write for the Telegraph with all that, but there we are. And I think that this is something that we have to bear very strongly in mind. We insist that that history, the post-Cold War history, is an important context. You only have to turn it round to see how important it would be. If it had been the Warsaw Pact, which was dissolved, by the way, if the Warsaw Pact had won the Cold War, if Warsaw Pact members currently included Belgium, Holland, France, and Spain, I think the British establishment would be screaming from the rooftops that their security was being endangered. If there was then a civil war in Jersey or Guernsey, I think that that would be an even more heightened sense of alarm. It's always good, I think, to ask yourselves, what would we be thinking if the tables were turned? So I think what we're watching here is the not the favored parallel of the media, is not a new Munich or a new appeasement, but what we might be watching is the effects of a new Versailles Treaty. When the First World War ended and a punishing peace was inflicted on Germany, including territorial annexation and economic reparations, the effect in Germany was to produce a virulent nationalism, which in the end led to the rise of the Nazis. I think the punitive peace inflicted on Russia after the end of the Cold War, and for a while it looked as if it was going to be different. Let's not forget the days when Putin was a welcomed member of the G8, when the Russia-NATO Cooperation Committee operated. Over the last 10 years, those bridges have been systematically dismantled. Russia was chucked out of the G8 after the invasion of the Crimea, but nobody was chucked out of the G8 after the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. So these are partial and selective responses to military action, which have produced a virulent nationalism in the Russian state. Doesn't spread to the Russian people, certainly not in their huge numbers, as the anti-war movement shows. But it's a present factor produced by that history. So let me just kind of begin to bring my remarks to a close by saying what I think we should be arguing in this country. So as I've said, we think that Ukraine should be allowed to pursue an independent course, free of the threat or reality of military intervention by its more powerful neighbor. We thought that in Afghanistan, we thought it in Iraq, and we think it now. But we also think that our government has a responsibility because its policies after the Cold War, successive British government policies, made this crisis happen and made it worse when it is happening. So our position, I think, should be that we want the Russians out of Ukraine, and we want the Ukraine to be a neutral country, that there should be no further expansion of NATO. We don't want one set of Russian robbers to be kicked out and another set of Western robbers to come in. We want to create conditions where the Ukrainian people have the greatest possibility of determining their own future. And we have a special responsibility here. Russia certainly is an imperialist country, but it's not as powerful an imperialist country as those collected together in NATO and led by the most powerful imperialist country in the world, the United States. Now, we aren't citizens in Russia. We can solidarize, we can send messages, we can hope to have delegations, we can amplify the voices of Russian peace protesters, but we aren't Russians. We are citizens in this country, and our government is a culpable imperialist power, and our job is to deal with them. And no Afghan could do that as well as we could, no Iraqi could do that as well as we could, and no Russian can do that as well as we could, and no Ukrainian can do that as well as we can. It is our special responsibility to look after the politics in this country and to deal with our own political establishment. There's a kind of dialogue that goes around on the left, and I think it's kind of exaggerated by the way in which social media works, that would give you the impression that you're a kind of disembodied international imperial judge, kind of floating above the conflicts of the world and apportioning blame as you see it equally across the globe. But while that might be good analysis, it's not good current politics. We live somewhere. We live concretely in this country and not in any other country. We can affect the politics of this country and are responsible for the politics of this country in a way that nobody else can be or is. And so our function, our primary function, is to deal with the kind of chauvinism and patriotism and the effects of that that are being built up in British society. Because believe me, Boris Johnson doesn't care any more for the fate of Ukrainians than he cared for the fate of Afghans or Iraqis. He will fight in the Ukraine down to the last drop of Ukrainian blood and down to the last penny in your pocket. And he's intending to do that. That's what sanctions will mean. They will hurt ordinary Russians and they will cost us. Liz Truss said today, oh, well, you know, there's going to be an even further, even bigger increase in energy bills because of these sanctions, but people will be happy to pay it. I don't think people are going to be happy to pay it to stoke conflict around the Russian border. So I think we've got to approach this very, very clearly indeed. We want to stop the war, we want the Russians out, we want no more NATO expansion, and we won't pay for their warmongering. And we have full solidarity with those people in Russia and elsewhere who are campaigning on the same basis. It's fantastic, huge demonstration in Italy yesterday under the slogan, no to Putin, and no to NATO. And I hope that next weekend we'll begin the process of mobilizing around that as well. We can't do that if we have a kind of what I call abstract anti-imperialism. All imperialisms are bad. That's true, but it doesn't deal with the question of where you are. Our imperialism is our main enemy, because it's here that we can be politically effective. And especially at a time when, as I said at the beginning, the establishment is very keen on anti-imperialism elsewhere. It loves Russian anti-imperialism, but they've got to be confronted with the kind of anti-imperialism they don't like, which is anti-imperialism directed at the British and Americans. And that's our job, to make sure that they are. We aren't uncritical Putin supporters. I know this is the constant allegation in the press, but I'll just say, let's say this. It seems very odd accusation, always seems a very odd accusation to make about Trotskyists. So the Daily Telegraph described me as a veteran Trotskyist. I'm very proud to be one. But being soft on Russia isn't really what we're known for. I mean, after all, they did the successor regime, indeed the successor to the secret service that Vladimir Putin was a colonel in, did put an ice pick in the back of Leon Trotsky's head, and that tends to dispose you rather badly towards favoritism towards the Russian regime. In fact, one thing you can say about the Trotskyist tradition is that it is probably the only mainstream left tradition which has been absolutely opposed to both fascism and Stalinism. And that remains our tradition. So we're not uncritical of Putin, far from it. I mean, I personally, and I think Claire Solomon from this organization, went to Russia on a journalist investigative delegation to make a film about fraud in Putin's Russia. I think there are quite a few media commentators who are on this case who haven't done that much. We were on a demonstration with anti-Putin protesters in Moscow, and I was proud to be so. I've been to peace conferences in Tbilisi in Georgia and cooperated with the radical anti-Putin left in Russia over many years. I intend to continue to do so, and this organization will continue to do that work. But we aren't going to make that the center of our work. The center of our work is to attack the Tories in this country. And we have to be secure and firm in that policy. People come under enormous pressure. And, you know, I'm sorry to see that the 11 Labour MPs who withdrew their name from the Stop the War statement did give in to that pressure. You know, I think that will damage the Labour Party and it will damage the Labour left. You can't have Boris Johnson saying to Keir Starmer one day, tell them to take their name off that statement or you'll withdraw the whip. He does it the next day and then they do it. That's just a debilitating stance to have for them more than us. The anti-war movement in this country, I think, will remain strong because it reflects very real opinion in this country. And I direct people on this point to just let me give you some recent YouGov opinion polls. 55% in this country are against airstrikes or the deployment of troops in Ukraine. 52% say they don't trust Johnson to handle this crisis. That's compared to 33% who say they do. And the figures are exactly the same, by the way, for Keir Starmer, which isn't surprising since his policy is exactly the same as Johnson's. And there are majorities against sanctions in this country if they hit the standard of living of working people in this country. So I'm not concerned that there aren't millions of people who share our view. I am concerned that the level of vituperation, the witch hunting atmosphere directed at those Labour MPs and at the Stop the War coalition will succeed in stopping those millions of people having a movement which publicly represents their views. I mean, I'll tell you how mad this has got when Tom Tugendhat, who is a possible next leader of the Tory party, and a war hawk the kind that we haven't seen very often in this country, when he gets up in the Commons, as he did this week, and says that he thinks the Prime Minister should update the 1351 Treason Act to deal with people who are sympathetic to Putin, and I don't suppose there's much of a competition in trying to guess who he means, we've got to quite a serious and threatening place. Now, the 1351 Treason Act, I don't know quite how he means to update it. Perhaps the clause that says that you're guilty of treason if you have sex with the Queen or one of the King's daughters will be replaced by a clause which says that you're guilty of treason if you sign a document by the Stop the War Coalition. But this kind of talk is funny if it weren't unhinged and dangerous. We need to re-establish in this country the broadest possible anti-war movement, which is absolutely clear on the nature of imperialism, that it's a competitive state and a competitive economic system in which all the players will subordinate the weak and the powerless to their own goals, both in other countries and in their own, and is absolutely clear-sighted that in each and every country, the main objective of the anti-war movement has to be to disable their own political establishment from being able to send us to war or make us pay for war and inflict misery both on populations in other parts of the globe and on most people in this country. Thanks very much.